You all got so quiet so fast. What are you, in a library or something? That was a better joke than that, no? Boy, what a fisherman. How's everyone doing tonight? All right, that's medium. We're going to get higher as we go because we have a lecture by the great Fintan O'Toole that I'm proud to help welcome in tonight. There you go. In a minute, I'm going to bring up my friend Emily Greenhouse, the editor of the New York Review of Books, to properly introduce Fintan O'Toole, but I'm here to welcome you from the library. My name is Aidan Flax-Clark. I'm the director of Live from NYPL. And this year, we are proud to bring you what I believe is the 25th annual Silvers Lecture, endowed by the philanthropist and computer pioneer Max Palevsky in 2002 in recognition of the work of Robert B. Silvers, co-founder with Barbara Epstein of the New York Review of Books. Joan Didion gave the first lecture in 2002, and since then we've welcomed a cavalcade of incredible writers, from M. Gesson to Mary Beard, Oliver Sacks to Zadie Smith, Skip Gates to Laurie Moore, and many, many others, and couldn't think of a better person to continue that tradition than Fintan tonight. Bob Silvers was as great a champion of the library as a person could be. He was on our board of trustees. We named him a library lion in 2014, and he helped bring the archives of the New York Review of Books here to this library, and we are very proud stewards of it. The collection covers 657 linear feet, and if you are not a library nerd, that is a lot. They comprise working files of the review's editors, publishers, and staff since the magazine began publication in 1963, and solicitations, rejections, manuscripts, financial papers, ad copy. The collection literally has it all. And on top of that, we have other amazing archival collections of regular contributors to the review. Joan Didion, Oliver Sacks, Lucy Sant, just to name a few. And like everything in this building, it is all free to any of you who would need to research in those collections with only your library card. And surely no one came in this building without a library card, right? You would be filled with shame if you did something like this, right? Okay. I'm going to trust that you're not lying to me. Speaking of library cards, you can also use that to check out Fintan's many books from one of our circulating branches, or you can buy his most recent book, which is available for sale right over there, For and Against a United Ireland, co-written with Sam McBride. And I believe that he will be signing copies of the book after the talk as well, which will be happening over there. And if that's not enough reading for you, hopefully you grabbed your copy of the New York Review of Books' most recent issue. It's available at the entrance, so if you didn't, grab one on your way out. I'd like to thank our friends at the magazine for their generosity in sharing those. When you came in the room, you received some note cards. Those are for asking questions. Fintan will be delighted to take some of your questions at the end of his talk. Some of my colleagues will come by and collect them while he's speaking. And if you are watching online, you can put your questions in the chat, and we'll get them there as well. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isbahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you here. So thank you for that support. And now I get to bring up Emily Greenhouse, who I inherited this lecture series with her from our respective predecessors, and working with her on it has been a total joy. All of the brilliance that she brings to the magazine, she brings to the curation of this lecture series, and she is a delightful human being to boot. So I hope you will join me in giving a very warm welcome to Emily Greenhouse.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Emily Greenhouse, the editor of the New York Review of Books. It's my honor to be here tonight to introduce Fintan O'Toole, a brilliantly incisive contributor to our magazine, as well as our advising editor, who will deliver the 2026 Robert B. Silvers Lecture, The Idiocy of Greatness. History is as potent a present as myth, Fintan once told his exacting editor at the Review, Jana Prickrell. The truth of that observation comes clear through Fintan's writing. He reads historical events from long ago or from yesterday through human drives and emotions, and in so doing, he helps us understand them. His work is rich with knowledge and unfailingly accessible, astonishingly fresh. Fintan's very first article for the Review in 1998 was about the Good Friday Agreement and the prospect of peace in Ireland. And now, nearly 30 years later, he's in the US in part to discuss his latest book, co-written with Sam McBride, about the prospect of a united Ireland. His work in our pages so far has bookended a time of transformation in his own country, from sectarian violence to overtures toward unity, which has certainly, perhaps ironically, informed and deepened his reading of American politics during the same period. For a time, his critical focus was theater and literature. He has written on a vast range of subjects, including Jonathan Swift, Amor McBride, a whole book's worth of essays on Samuel Beckett, W.H. Auden, Hilary Mantel, Hemingway, John le Carré, the diaries of Richard Burton, Ibsen, Celtic myths, and much more. But always running through his penetrating essays on literature and the theater are diagnoses of politics, especially American politics. His essay on the uneasy, even dastardly way that the President of the United States is and is not funny opens in the Warsaw Ghetto and ends with this acute observation. This is the thing about Trump's form of organized laughter, in which the idea of humor obscures the distinction between outlandish words and real-life actions. Sooner or later, the first becomes the second. The in-joke becomes the killer line. On a human level, because Fintan always encourages us to think at the human level, I have rarely met a person of greater warmth and self-evident goodness. Fintan's son Sam and I will both turn 40 this year, and he told me at lunch this week that he spent his own 40th birthday on assignment from Pete Hamill in Vermont with the Von Trapp family, unable to get home to the pub where his friends awaited him. Well, this year, he spent his birthday on a Zoom call with Yana and me, and when my children burst into the room to see what was going on, they began to interrogate Fintan about where the tooth fairy stays when she is in Dublin, and what she gives children there, and how she gets around. He obliged with many answers, and I think now they want to visit and see. Fintan is what they call, in Gaelic, a mensch. There is no one in whose mind we place more moral trust in this difficult time, and I'm thrilled to announce that we are launching a New York Review podcast, Endgame, that Fintan will begin hosting later this spring. Stay tuned. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to the podium this writer of vital voice, Fintan O'Toole.
Good evening, friends. Thank you so much for being here. It's one of the honors of my life to give the Robert Silvers Memorial Lecture. There were only a small number of copies of the New York Review used to come into Dublin, and you had to sort of, the word would go round, they've arrived, and there'd be a scramble to get them, and there was always this terrible disappointment when you realized that Colm Tóibín had got the last one. I really couldn't believe my luck when I was plucked from deserved obscurity by Bob Silvers, in the 1990s, it's just been one of the great blessings of my life. I'm sure many of you knew Robert Silvers, certainly knew his work, knew the impact he had, and continues to have. He's still a great presence in all of our lives. So let's begin. If, as Karl Marx claimed, everything in history happens twice, the first time as tragedy and the second as farce, we're in the second time of empires. But, of course, there were elements of farce in the enormous human tragedy of the first go-around of empires. And there are elements of tragedy, of course, in the second. Tragedy happens when two entirely contradictory forces are moving together in lockstep and can't be separated. In the imperial delusion, those two forces are greatness and self-abasement. On February the 14th, the US Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio addressed the Munich Security Conference in Germany. he evoked with evident regret the demise of what he called the great Western empires, and promised that if only Europe and the United States could come together in shrugging off embarrassment about this past, they could together restore greatness. The vaulted ceilings of the Sistine Chapel and the towering spires of the great cathedral in Cologne, they testify not just to the greatness of our past or to a faith in the God that inspired these marvels. They foreshadow the wonders that await us in our future. But only if we are unapologetic in our heritage and proud of this common heritage. The message was clear. Greatness is the rightful inheritance of a Euro-American civilization. It's been lost through the demise of the great Western empires, but it can be restored if only the realities of those empires are forgotten. And then the wonders of a new golden age await us. Sometimes the second go-around of these things looks a little bit like the beginning of the first go-around, because, of course, all of this stuff was there 300-400 years ago when, for example, the British Empire was coming into its own. But also an understanding of the potentially farcical elements in the tragedy it was about to bring to the world. On October 28th, it will be 300 years since a travel book by a previously obscure author appeared in London. It was called Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World. Opposite the title page was a portrait of the writer, said to be, quote, first a surgeon, then a captain of several ships. Interspersed with the text were 4 maps accurately depicting known places like Sumatra, Japan, and indeed North America, with newly discovered islands and peninsulas etched in. It looked for all the world like another English voyager's account from the still unfolding age of European discovery, which was also, of course, the emerging age of European colonialism. This explorer, as he tells us in his narrative, is indeed himself a great believer in imperialism, explaining as he does that, quote, if a prince send forces into a nation where the people are poor and ignorant, he may lawfully put half of them to death and make slaves of the rest in order to civilize and reduce them from their barbarous way of living. This book, as you've probably guessed, is, of course, the great literary hoax that we now call Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. But that's not, of course, how it appeared. Nobody was supposed to know, and it didn't have that title at the time. Unlike his ventriloquist dummy Lemuel Gulliver, Swift had a great hatred of colonialism, a rage that causes him late in the book to commit the literary sin, but perhaps the moral and political act of courage of breaking the voice. Later on, he breaks character, as it were, and assumes a high style of rhetoric and of savage indignation that seems far beyond Gulliver's own linguistic powers. He's talking about colonialism, and he says, here commences a new dominion acquired with a title by divine right. Ships are sent with the first opportunity, the natives driven out to be destroyed, their princes tortured to discover their gold, a free license given to all acts of inhumanity and lust, the earth reeking with the blood of its inhabitants. And this execrable crew of butchers employed in so pious an expedition, is a modern colony sent to convert and civilize an idolatrous and barbarous people. To prepare the ground for this excoriation of the way barbarism and civilization were becoming the juggler's tricks that distract from the rapacity and brutality of empires, Swift draws his readers into a vivid exploration of the idea of magnitude. What does it mean to be great? What does it mean to be small? The first two of the four parts of the book are literature's most famous game of greatness. Swift had read the work of his friend and fellow Dubliner George Berkeley, who pointed out that these are not absolute ideas. There's nothing absolute about being great or being small. They depend on perception. To quote Berkeley, he says, "The judgments we make of greatness do, in like manner as those of distance, depend on the disposition of the eyes." So Gulliver in Lilliput finds himself, of course, as a giant among tiny people. According to the disposition of their eyes, he is an immense and thus almighty creature. He experiences greatness in its most literal form. But then on his next voyage to Brobdingnag, he suddenly realizes that he's now the tiny person in a land inhabited by giants. His own body, of course, has not changed. He's exactly as he was. But the meaning of his body, the meaning of who he is, has been utterly transformed in these two different contexts. He describes the shock when he's in Brobdingnag of realizing how tiny he is now compared to the giant he was in Lilliput. In this terrible agitation of mind, I could not forbear thinking of Lilliput, whose inhabitants looked upon me as the greatest prodigy that had ever appeared in the world, where I was able to draw an imperial fleet in my hand and perform those other actions which will be recorded forever in the chronicles of that empire, while posterity shall hardly believe them, although attested by millions. I reflected what a mortification it must prove to me to appear as inconsiderable in this nation as one single Lilliputian would be among us. Then he reflects, undoubtedly philosophers are in the right when they tell us that nothing is great or little otherwise than by comparison. It might have pleased fortune to let the Lilliputians find some nation where the people were as diminutive with respect to them as they were to me. And who knows but that even this prodigious race of mortals might be equally overmatched in some distant part of the world whereof we have yet no discovery. What Gulliver experiences at this moment is the dizzying realization that he can never really be at home again, either in his own body or in his own country. He has entered the imperial condition. He can never again be merely himself. He can never be normal. He must remember being his Lilliputian self, the greatest prodigy that ever appeared in the world, or his Brobdingnagian self, the contemptibly inconsiderable homunculus. Since nothing is great or little otherwise than by comparison, he's forced to hover neurotically between greatness and littleness. Because the terms of this comparison are strictly binary. There are only the great and the diminutive, and indeed, when they're dressed up in their fancy clothes, only the civilized and the barbarous. One is either massively aggrandized or utterly mortified. Now, Swift's Storytelling is, of course, fabulously imaginative and full of comic absurdity, but his evocation of this imperial condition is razor sharp. He was writing in the years when both European colonialism and the slave trade were being turbocharged, and both of these interrelated enterprises create and are sustained by precisely this binary opposition. Comparison is all. Compared to the humblest free white man, every enslaved black person is inconsiderable. Compared to every member of a colonized nation, every member of the colonizing nation is a giant. One belongs either to the greatest nation on earth or to the wretched of the earth. Greatness thus depends on their being a wretched of the earth. It is a condition entirely dependent on the continued existence of its opposite. The long and in some ways incomplete overthrow of slavery and the dismantling of the European empires, both of which we can see very roughly as culminating in the 1960s, created the conditions in which it was possible to, as it were, normalize being normal. By normal, I mean an escape from Gulliver's dizzying predicament, the ability to be neither great nor negligible, but comfortably on the same level as everyone else. To go back to Berkeley's disposition of the eyes, we might evoke the philosopher Philip Pettit's eye test for the existence of a genuine republic. He says, you know you're in a republic when you have the ability, quote, to look one another in the eye without reason for fear or deference. And by normalizing, I mean making this principle into a potentially governing political ethic. I'm not for a moment suggesting that status anxiety or structures of assumed superiority and enforced inferiority ever retreated from social and economic life. But I am suggesting that the social movements demanding an end to racial, gender, sexual and class inequalities gained more of the centre ground in the democracies during this period. Those movements were driven by those who had experienced the contempt of the great. But they also made it so that it turned out that both people and nations who had been on the more privileged side of the divide could live quite happily without greatness. It's very interesting if you're in Northern Europe, for example, to look at places, some of the happiest, most successful places on the planet, like Sweden, like Denmark, like Holland, all had very, very extensive empires, lost them, and then more or less forgot about them and got on with being reasonably happy. It turned out, you know, that people could live without greatness, in particular, if they could swap great for better. Great pretensions for better lives, better housing, better pay and conditions, better access to education and health care, better control over one's own body and one's own sexuality, but also more respect. The irony of greatness for those who occupied its lower rungs, and of course most white people occupied the lower rungs of greatness, they were still in comparison part of the system of greatness and inferiority. But the irony for them was that while it did not demand their utter subjection, it did demand their deference. The imperial state gives those who belong to it a sense of superiority, but it demands in return a surrender to grandeur. What the liberation movements and the civil rights movements and the feminist movements and the LGBTQ movements and the labor movements taught us, taught not just their own members, but democracies as a whole, is that the opposite of greatness is not, in fact, abjection, it's dignity. There's a connection here to something W.B. Yeats said, that we're also in Ireland thinking about a centenary. 1926 was the year of Sean O'Casey's great play, The Plough and the Stars, and the riots which greeted it. The play was set during the 1916 Rising, which was a sort of key moment in the development of Irish independence. And it gave a somewhat less than heroic account of what that looked like for people at the bottom of the rung in Dublin, which upset a lot of people. And what the nationalists who were rioting in the Abbey Theatre were upset about was that the play did not merely not depict Dubliners or indeed revolutionaries as heroic. It showed them to be merely and therefore unbearably ordinary. During the week of the riots, Yeats happened to be giving a talk about his poetry in a club in Dublin. And he was asked about the riots just from the floor. And his answer is just reported in the newspaper account, so it's in the third person. But it's rather remarkable, I think, and very much apt to our current condition. And what he said was that there's a difference between national pride and national vanity. The moment a nation reached intellectual maturity, it became exceedingly proud and ceased to be vain. And when it became exceedingly proud, it did not disguise its faults. But when it was immature, it was exceedingly vain and did not believe in itself. I think it's fair to say that America is in a state where national pride is being replaced as the official doctrine by national vanity, in Yeats' sense. National vanity, indeed, is arguably dependent on the absence of national pride. To be proud of one's country is, as Yeats says, not to disguise its faults, but to want to believe that the country is capable of rising above them. The keynote of national pride is what we always say is, we're better than this. We can do better than this. National vanity, on the contrary, is indeed, as Yeats suggested, a form of disguise. It uses the mask of greatness to cover up society's complex realities. The dark parts of its history and the persistent strains of injustice must be erased. The dignity of self-knowledge is sacrificed to the willed ignorance of inflated self-esteem. Self-belief is replaced by self-delusion. The most effective safeguards against the lure of greatness are that belief in betterment and the dignity of being able to look one another in the eye without reason for fear or deference. And these are the very defenses that have been stripped away in recent decades. The stalling of generational social mobility has undercut belief in better. It's increasingly unlikely in most developed democracies that young people will have better standards of living and better access to education, housing, and healthcare than their parents did. And the rise of this economic inequality is accompanied by the ever more flagrant displays of vast superiority by a brash and brazen oligarchy, which means that our societies ever more obviously fail the eye test. It's in this context that we get a return to a form of politics in which, like Gulliver, citizens can be made to hover between the poles of massive aggrandizement and utter mortification. These opposites, as I was suggesting, come as a package. They must be experienced together. The great leader casts the people imaginatively down into the pit of abjection so that he, and of course only he, can lift them up into hyper-inflated greatness. He does so because he has nothing to offer in between, no betterment, no dignity, no sense of equality. In fact, not just no sense of equality, but a rejection of equality altogether. When greatness is evoked as the natural condition of the nation, equality is humiliation. Because greatness can only be measured by comparison, it cannot exist on the level. This was very much the dynamic of Brexit in the United Kingdom. The European Union affords each of its members, including petty, insignificant countries like Ireland, the same status, the same legal status, which is, of course, an affront to those who know themselves to be exceptional and even have great in the name of their country. And, of course, for the United States to be bound by international law, to be a partner in global organizations and a party to international treaties is innately humiliating. It's to be bound like Gulliver by 1,000 Lilliputian strings. The sense of humiliation turns the world upside down. And one of its characteristics is that it requires to be seen. Again, it's very much about perception. As the poet Wayne Kostenbaum puts it, humiliation, a topsy-turvy regime, involves a reversal from top to bottom, from high to low, from exalted to degraded, from secure to insecure. The reversal happens quickly. Someone must be there to watch it happen and to carry the news elsewhere. In this regard, humiliation creates a different kind of eye test. It's concerned not with how we are looking one another in the eye, but with how we look in the eyes of the world. One of Donald Trump's most consistent refrains from long before he entered politics, right up to last night, they use it again, is that they are laughing at us. This comes up again and again. A Washington Post analysis in January 2016 found that at that point, over 10 years ago, Trump had already used this trope at least 103 times, going back to 1987, when he took out a full-page ad in the paper, "Let's not let our great country be laughed at anymore. They laugh at us behind our backs. They laugh at us because of our own stupidity," he said on Larry King Live when he was 41 years old. "The world is laughing at us," was one of the catchphrases of his campaigns in 2015 and 2016, and again in 2019 and 2020. The named sniggerers include, at different times, China, the world in general, OPEC, Mexico, Iran, Russia, terrorists, mullahs, and the Persians. Now, to be laughed at is to be belittled, but it's also to be made a show of. Humiliation, says Kostenbaum, has its rewards, among them the privilege of being seen as exemplary, the pleasure of being a spectacle. Gulliver in Brobdingnag is utterly humiliated by his littleness and powerlessness, but he is also an exciting exhibition, an object of wonder. Trump's constant evocation of the idea that the world has nothing better to do but sit around and laugh at America is not incompatible with American exceptionalism. In fact, it's a kind of backhanded compliment to it. This is not petty humiliation, it's epic humiliation. Like the scene in the Iliad when the warrior hero Ajax slips and falls in cow dung and is laughed at mightily. The vast scale of the laughter is proof of his magnitude, It actually confirms the greatness of its object. The pleasure of being made a show of is allied to the pleasure of self-pity. Greatness is appealing in part because it politicizes the gratifying sensation of feeling deeply sorry for yourself. We tend to think of self-pity as being similar to low self-esteem, but it's in fact a form of self-regard, and this is why it's pleasurable. The early 19th century English radical Leigh Hunt, in his commentary on John Keats, picks up on a phrase of Keats's in the poem Music, flattered to tears. And Hunt says, in this word flattered is the whole theory of the secret of tears, which are the tributes more or less worthy of self-pity to self-love. Whenever we shed tears, we take pity on ourselves, and we feel, if we do not consciously say so, that we deserve to have pity taken. The more highly we think of ourselves, the sorrier we feel for ourselves when we do not get what we know we deserve. Herbert Spencer, in The Principles of Psychology, published in 1855, puzzled over the emotion he variously called pleasurably painful sentiment, the luxury of grief and self-pity. It seems possible, he writes, this sentiment may arise from dwelling on the contrast between his own worth, as he estimates it, and the treatment he has received. If he feels he has deserved much while he has received little, and still more if instead of good there has come evil, the consciousness of this evil is qualified by the consciousness of worth, made pleasurably dominant by contrast. One who contemplates his own affliction as undeserved necessarily contemplates his own merit. There is an idea of much withheld and a feeling of implied superiority to those who withhold it. Self-pity thus combines two things that may otherwise seem incompatible: a deep sense of grievance and a high sense of superiority. It's important, of course, to distinguish self-pity from righteous and rightful indignation. People should feel indignant about being oppressed and impoverished, disrespected and silenced. Some of the energy of the reactionary movements that threaten democracy is undoubtedly fueled by a sense of loss that's rooted in economic decline and cultural dislocation. But the beauty of self-pity from the point of view of reactionary politics is that it's not dependent on any objective reality of oppression or injustice. It's proportionate to one's sense of having deserved much. The sense of injustice it feeds off is entirely about one's sense of one's own proper status. To put it simply, if you always turn left when you get on a plane, but for some reason you get relegated to economy class, you will spend the trip feeling very sorry for yourself. If you always sit in economy class, it's just what it is. And if you've always known that your skin color or your gender or your sexuality or your nationality entitles you to privilege, mere equality feels like victimhood. A near synonym for humiliation is degradation, literally being taken down a grade or two. And the thing about this sense of degradation is that it can be deeply felt even if nothing has really changed for you. Gulliver's body doesn't alter between Lilliput and Brobdingnag, but his sense of it swings radically from exaltation to degradation. Similarly, a white man may remain highly privileged but still feel that he is being downgraded if a black woman is rising up. Nothing is great or little otherwise than by comparison. The feeling of belittlement also becomes very easily a sense of victimhood. This is what far-right movements across the world have both conjured up and mobilized, just as they did in the 1920s and the 1930s. What they do is to replace the idea of universal rights with the idea of just deserts. It's a double idea. We should get our just desserts as Americans, as men, as white people, and those who are preventing us from having them should get theirs. Greatness conveys entitlement, and those who prevent us from getting that to which we are entitled must be punished. The wonderful English writer Alan Bennett recently in his diary noticed a prerequisite for happiness is to be without entitlement, not to feel you are owed a place in the world. But conversely, a prerequisite for eternal unhappiness is a simmering rage against those who have refused to give us our entitlements. This is all very depressing. I'm sure you're really enjoying it. So I'd just like to, the last part of this is about a couple of thoughts on the weakness of greatness and what its problems are. The overwhelming weakness of the politics of greatness is that, of course, it cannot bring genuine justice. But its overwhelming strength is that it can deliver it in the potently toxic form of revenge. It's interesting, striking, someone who's written about theatre so much. I mean, so much of theatre, really going back to the Greeks and all through Shakespeare, is about what is tragedy? Tragedy is when you get revenge rather than getting justice. You know, and the human search for some way to balance that out. But if you can't have justice, you get revenge. That's what the far right is offering. I am your justice, Donald Trump declared in 2023. And for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. The good leader offers mere concrete betterment. The great one offers the thrilling double act of victimhood and vengeance. In my own country, famously, Sinn Féin, when it was rising after the 1916 rising, I think a New York Times reporter interviewed the General Secretary of Sinn Féin and said, "What is the programme of Sinn Féin?" He said, "Vengeance by Jesus." This dance of humiliation and hype has an aesthetics as well as a politics. What used to be called Burkean conservatism is disappearing before our eyes, and those of us who are instinctively critical of it are forced to mourn with Joni Mitchell that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. But Burkean conservatism and Burke appealed, even then probably nostalgically and anachronistically, to an idea of modest scale. What Edmund Burke himself, who was incidentally a student at Trinity College Dublin while Jonathan Swift was Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral a few blocks away in Dublin, called the little platoons of family, church and community as the foundations of what he called public affection. But if Burke's politics are vanishing, his aesthetics are thriving, in his first book, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, Burke called attention to the reality that there is a kind of sadomasochistic delight in the aesthetic experience of terror. Whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, that is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible or is conversant about terrible objects or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. Contemporary reactionary politics is a politics of the sublime, pain invoked, pain distanced, pain rendered politically delightful. This was true of Brexit, which depended on the evocation of the idea of Britain, in fact, a free and prosperous country, as enslaved and oppressed by the European Union. And it's true of Trump. Before him, American political rhetoric including conservative rhetoric, had a grammar of uplift, the American dream, Kennedy's new frontier, Reagan's morning in America, Obama's arc of history bending towards justice. But Trump, from the beginning of his campaign in 2015, went for the full sublime. He created a vision of America as a hellhole, what he called in his first inaugural address, if you remember, American carnage. He imagined it for his fans as a country on the verge of obliteration. But of course, this is necessary in order for the other side of it to work. The absolute objection is necessary for absolute greatness. And so, of course, he also presented a dramatic denouement, the appearance of what Gulliver called the greatest prodigy that ever appeared in the world. I think Trump would now regard that as something of an understatement, which, of course, could transform this abjection into its opposite, greatness. Strikingly, Burke noted that the sublime, what he calls the sublime, it operates at both the levels of, the great and of the level of the tiny. That's a bit like the Swiftian experience that Gulliver has. Burke says that the great extreme of dimension is sublime, so that the last extreme of littleness is in some measure sublime likewise. Nor can we distinguish in its effects this extreme of littleness from the vast itself. This is because, and I think he's quite foretelling here, he says, in our experiencing of the sublime, the imagination is lost as well as the sense. Burke seemed to have had previews of some of Trump's speeches, because his description of this loss of sense, of the movement between the hyper-exaggerated and the utterly trivial, is absolutely characteristic of a Trump weave. And Trump's description of what happens when we lose this sense, again, is very reminiscent of a Trump speech. He says, all is dark, uncertain, confused, terrible, and sublime to the last degree. The mind is hurried out of itself by a crowd of great and confused images which affect because they are crowded and confused. Perhaps what we get in this politics of the sublime is a bastardized form of tragedy. Tragedy, according to Aristotle, deals in greatness, but it produces pity and terror. This contemporary sublime politics turns up the dial on greatness, but it produces self-pity and terror. And perhaps what you get when you replace pity with self-pity is the impossibility of revelation. Revelation in tragedy triggers reversal, a change of fortune. When the messenger tells Oedipus what he's really done, it's not just rather upsetting news for the king, though I'm sure it probably is that. It means that he can no longer be king. Power must fall because of revelation. But that's also the crucial mechanism of democratic life. When perfidy is revealed on the side of the powerful, they can no longer be powerful. But when terror is ramped up and pity is not for the state of the country or the world or the human condition, but for oneself, revelation doesn't matter. It cannot have consequences. Poor Richard Nixon must be thinking about, what did I ever do? I got some guys to break into an office and I lied about it, Yet, even in its own terms, and this is my desperate attempt at some uplift, greatness is not so great. It's, of course, firstly, hugely vulnerable to the whims and foibles of the man, and it is nearly always a man who embodies it. Megalomaniacs get caught in a vicious circle where sycophancy reinforces their sense of infallibility, and their sense of infallibility cannot abide anyone who is not a sycophant. rational decision-making collapses. Greatness can lapse very quickly into idiocy. No reference to contemporary events, isn't it? And then, of course, there's the problem of succession. The point of the leader who embodies greatness is that he is unique, one-off, God-appointed. Absolute monarchies dealt with this problem by imagining that greatness passed through the bloodline. And even when that idea seemed credible, it was as often disproved as it was vindicated. One word I just might say is Andrew. But without heredity, and by the way, heredity is not impossible as a solution to the succession crisis in America, genetic heredity. I think there are some more of them out there. But without hereditary, there is no obvious way to make a one-off, a two-off, or a three-off, or an eternal bloodline of greatness. But the largest underlying problem of greatness is the inevitability of disappointment. The national vanity of greatness is always backward-looking. It must return again and again to the idea of the new golden age, a trope of Boris Johnson's brief post-Brexit ascendancy in Britain, or of Putin's Russia, and of course of Trump's America. This, he began his State of the Union address last month, is the golden age of America. But the whole point of the golden age is not just that it must always be in the past, hence the again in MAGA, or the back in Take Back Control, which was the Brexit slogan, but that it exists only to show up the terrible decadence of the present. The golden age is first elaborated in Hesiod's Works and Days as a long ago era in which people had neither facts nor processes to worry about. Like gods, they lived with spirits free from care. The whole point of the golden age is that it is outside history. It merely exists as the ideal from which humanity has been expelled forever. After it, Hesiod tells us, comes the age in which they had no self-control, could not restrain themselves from wreaking outrages and pain. If that sounds familiar, it's not coincidental. The golden age of greatness and the brass-necked age of unrestrained outrages and pain are, again, indissolubly paired. Greatness promises fulfillment and security, but it is always radically insecure. First, because it can't live without its opposite. It can't just decree that everything is now great in the new golden age. To do so would be to make itself redundant. It must continue to foment the terror of objection that is its evil twin. It's radically opposed to the American Revolution's elevation of the pursuit of happiness as the goal of human life. It must pursue unhappiness. The golden age cannot be enjoyed because only the great leader stands between it and total annihilation. Second big weakness is that greatness has no stable meaning in itself, as we've seen, and is always a matter of comparison, and therefore it cannot be a steady state. It must get ever more great. Inflation can't be stopped. It must expand to infinity and beyond, or perhaps to Greenland and beyond. And since it can never be achieved or satisfied, greatness generates narratives of betrayal and reactions of frustration. Both bend towards violence. Violence alone transcends the contradictions of greatness. It simplifies superiority and inferiority into the brutal binary of the killer and the killed. A few minutes from where Swift wrote Gulliver in Dublin, there's a statue of the early 20th century Labour leader James Larkin, who, in Yeats's phrase, not entirely approving, hurled the little streets upon the great. On the statue is inscribed the phrase, Larkin often used in his speeches to the poor of Dublin. The great only appear great because we are on our knees. Let us arise. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. I'm just going to take some of the questions that you've very, very kindly put in. The first one is, it says, in your view, how do we rehabilitate this society-wide historic entitlement in the US? You know, it's one of the ironies, isn't it, of sort of far-right politics, that it tends to start off attacking people for having a sense of entitlement. You know, it denounces ordinary people for the temerity to feel entitled to, you know, have decent housing, to have a right to education, to have a right to a living wage, to have a right to certain equality, and then it sort of shifts into a very different sense of entitlement. You know, which is the entitlement of class, the entitlement of race, the entitlement of nationality. So it seems to me that progressive politics has to try to break that pairing, you know, that way in which the whole idea of entitlement is both evoked and then you know, is shifted over into very toxic kind of forms. We do have to get back to the very basic ideas that, you know, good societies are ones that give people an entitlement to the sort of basic things that you need in order to be a citizen in a republic, in order to have equality, in order to have dignity. You know, entitlement in the rhetoric really took hold in the late 70s, early 1980s, became a source of shame. You know, only lazy people feel entitled. In fact, it ought to be a sense of the title of being an equal citizen, of belonging. It's a mark of respect and dignity that one is entitled to the necessities. I think it's interesting in American politics that people are again talking about practicalities, affordability. They're not narrow things, they're about how people live. Nothing is more undignified than the scramble for day-to-day existence. We know that it's possible to organize our societies in ways that most people don't have to do that. I think it's our return to that very basic sense that there are perhaps, you know, the ideal of absolute equality is one we're never going to achieve, and some of the ways in which people tried to achieve it turned out to be brutal and inhumane. But the idea that we're moving towards greater equality was actually accepted for many, many, many decades in this country and in many other countries. We need to resuscitate it. The question, what are the best ways to demystify ideologies of exceptionalism? Well, the best ways, as with everything, I mean, are you know, access to a sense of history. One of the reasons I think we need to be in a constant dialogue with history is it tells us what nations are, you know, this national exceptionalism. And by the way, small nations do this sometimes just as much as large nations do. This idea of greatness and lost greatness, you know, is in Hungary, for example, you know, greater Hungary is lost forever, like, you know, but we could maybe dream it back. But perhaps the best answer to it is Ernst Renan, the French political theorist from the late 19th century, wrote a famous essay called "What is a Nation?" And I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said a nation is a group of people held together by common misconceptions about their origins. You know, and the construction of nations, you know, is always as well as a process of forgetting. It's a process of forgetting the violence. It's a process of forgetting the injustice. It's also a process of forgetting how all societies, all cultures are formed as mongrels out of many, many different kinds of streams. I've spent a couple of weeks going around talking about this Irish project I've been doing, and talking to a lot to Irish Americans, and many of whom have become more right-wing over time. And one of the things I've been trying to remind them, you know, is just as, you know, nothing is great or abject other than by comparison. I mean, the Irish, for example, were, you know, abject. Many, many, many of them, millions of them, when they came here in the post-famine era, they were, you know, they were the other for very many indigenous Americans, and then they made themselves into, you know, part of American exceptionalism. You know, it's not any coincidence that Yankee Doodle Dandy, for example, is an Irish creation, Irish song, you know. So this urge to fit in by joining in with the sort of exceptionalist idea of America has been felt, I suppose, by every ethnic group. But one of the ways of combating that is actually just talking to people about their own origins, about, you know, who they are, where they came from, and what you find always in any discussion about, you know, ethnic history is pretty much everybody was the outgroup at some stage, you know, and there are very few exceptions made to that, and the great, you know, way of combating exceptionalism is the reminder of common histories, of common suffering, and it's about saying that victimhood is not somebody's possession. You know, it's something which has been shared, has been overcome, and that suffering should give us a capacity to understand the suffering of other people now. I might just take one more. This year marks the 250th anniversary of Declaration of Independence. What's the proper way, if there is such a way, of recognizing and handling this document in the midst of so much political divide today? Is it foolish? I don't think it's foolish at all. I mean, these anniversaries are always opportunities for talking, for discussing, for trying to engage with complexities, with realities, to get beyond the sloganeering. There's going to be a deluge of greatness, and it's, you know, going to be thoroughly sick of it by the end of the year. But no event as complex as the American Revolution doesn't have, you know, many, many, many ways into it, which can actually allow us to talk about both the terrible failures of the revolution, its terrible hypocrisies, but also some of its extraordinary impulses, for all its terrible faults. You know, as Lincoln said, it was an experiment that could vanish from the face of the earth, and it's an experiment which could vanish from the face of the earth again. You know, the best way for me to mark and think about the American Revolution is to do so with a sense of danger, with the sense that whatever it achieved can be undone, and in some ways is being undone. And if something comes out of the 250th anniversary, it's the passion and urgency of citizens to make sure that there's at least another 250 years. Thank you very much. Thank you.